Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? Luke 11:3. These are the words of John the Baptist, the one who leapt in his mother's womb at the presence of the embryo of the Messiah, who knew Jesus was the Messiah before his birth. He's asking, are you the one? Because Jesus didn't appear to fulfill the expectations the people had for what the Messiah was supposed to do or look like. And a lot of people are still asking this question, was he the one, or is there one still to come? So today we're going to be investigating that question. Is Jesus the Messiah? Welcome to the Mom Apologist, where apologetics meets discipleship. This is a safe place for your doubts, where we seek to answer the question, God is real, the Bible's true, now what? So join me as we learn to think biblically about how to walk through this life as believers, struggling with tough questions, seeking hope, and finding answers together. Is Jesus the Messiah? Now, this is a tough question to answer in a short podcast, but I want to give you enough information that you can trust as we go into the week celebrating Christmas, that we are celebrating the birth of our Messiah, whether it's December 25th or not, as you can check out in my last week's podcast about the date and how we chose it. But I want you to know that we can celebrate Jesus as the Messiah in good faith. So we're going to talk today about the odds that Jesus fulfilled messianic prophecies by chance. Was he just a charismatic teacher? Was he just someone who happened to kind of fit the bill? Or is there more to it than that? Is there something intentional? Something that could only be one person in all of history? Something pretty extraordinary. Because Christianity isn't a faith built on your feelings. It's not built on a blind hope. It is built on history, text, prophecy. It is built on concrete things that we can look to as evidence and look to build a cumulative case for why we believe what we believe. And that even includes mathematics. So today we're going to look at three different things specifically. What did the prophecies actually say? And there are hundreds of prophecies in the Old Testament. We're only going to look at a handful. We're going to look at some of the ones that Jesus couldn't control, that he either fulfilled or didn't based on external circumstances, because I think those are the most powerful. And we're then going to look at the statistical probability that anybody would fulfill these prophecies accidentally or by chance. Now, one of the most unique features of Christianity is that God tells us the story before it happens. The Old Testament doesn't just give us moral lessons and this is how you should live. It gives us specific testable claims about who the Messiah is going to be, where he'd be born, what tribe he would come from, how would he die, how would he be treated here on earth, and what would happen after his death. Now, these prophecies were written over a period of 1,000 or more years by multiple authors over different locations, different time periods, by people who never met each other. So very long period of time before Jesus was born, we have people prophesying his arrival in various levels of detail. And this matters, as like some of my favorite authors point out, J. Warner Wallace, that we don't look for just one single piece of evidence. If we were going to base our entire life on one piece of evidence, that would feel pretty flimsy to me. I like to know that I'm basing my life on solid foundation. So we look for a cumulative case. We're never going to have every single question answered. We want to answer the most questions with the best evidence so that we can have a secure faith, that we have the preponderance of evidence, that you can trust something is true even if you don't have every single piece of evidence. Now, if we had one fulfilled prophecy That might be coincidence. 5, that's pretty interesting. But when you start adding up dozens, especially ones that are outside of somebody's control, we start to ask, is there more going on here? And the entire Old Testament is filled with prophecies. Some theologians count over 300 messianic prophecies. In fact, we see one of those prophecies in the very beginning of the Bible. The very first book, Genesis 3:15, right after Adam and Eve sin, God promises the serpent that a descendant of Eve will come to defeat him. Now, this is really interesting the way it's phrased, because in ancient Near Eastern language and genealogy, they would trace the seed through the man. So you wouldn't trace a lineage through a woman's line. So the fact that the Bible verse in Genesis specifically says the woman's seed or the woman's offspring, depending on how it's translated, is startling, or would have been startling to that audience. And most of Christian theology recognizes this as the very first messianic prophecy of the Messiah coming through the female line alone, which implies, of course, the virgin birth. Now, we see that hint confirmed in Galatians 4:4, where Paul states that the Messiah was born of a virgin. So the fulfillment of that prophecy is really one of the reasons why Christmas is so special, because we're celebrating that very first prophecy about the reconciliation of man to God being fulfilled. A descendant of Eve has been born who will defeat Satan and restore us to right relationship with God. And can we know that that was Jesus? I think we can. And we're going to examine the reasons why we have that belief. Now, let's start with the strongest category, the prophecies that Jesus had no control over. He couldn't control where he was born. The prophecy was, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be the ruler in Israel." That's from Micah 5:2. And we see that fulfillment, that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, in Matthew 2:1 and Luke 2, verses 4 through 7. But Jesus' parents lived in Nazareth. So how did it come that he was born in Bethlehem? Well, a Roman census forced them to go to Bethlehem in Luke 2, verses 1 through 3. Jesus couldn't have controlled that. His parents couldn't have controlled that. Rome controlled that. Jesus couldn't have controlled his lineage. The Bible predicts that the Messiah will be a descendant of Abraham in Genesis 12:3, 22:18. We see that fulfilled in Matthew 1:1 and in Galatians 3:16. We see that he'd come from the tribe of Judah in Genesis 49:10. And that's fulfilled in Luke 3:33 and Hebrews 7:14. I think that the prediction about Judah, that the choice vine would be tied to the donkey's foal, is a very unique prophecy, because we don't see till later that Jesus calls himself the vine. And we see him right on the donkey's foal. And those are some of the prophecies that he could have controlled, but he couldn't have controlled coming from the tribe of Judah. And that was a promise given to Judah. We know that he came from the line of David from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 and 13, or Isaiah 11:1. And we see that fulfilled in Luke chapter 1, 32 through 33. And we know that Luke's commentary on Jesus' life is spectacularly detailed, and that he researched it. He was, as Lee Strobel puts it, like the first investigative journalist. He went around and asked people for the details and examined evidence before including it in his writing. So Jesus couldn't choose his genealogy. You can't control the people that come before you. God promised that he would send someone before the Messiah. In Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, he promises that he will send an Elijah ahead of him, declaring the way of the Lord. And we see that fulfilled later in John the Baptist, where he goes out into the wilderness and he is declaring the way of the Lord, and he's turning the hearts of people back to God after 400 years of silence in that intertestamental period. So we think that's really interesting. Jesus couldn't have controlled somebody else's behavior. Now, this gets us back to John the Baptist being the one who asked the question, are you the one who's to come? So in Luke 11:3, he says, are you him or not? And Jesus doesn't critique him. He doesn't chastise him. He immediately points to some specific things. He says, go back and tell him, John the Baptist who's in prison, go back and tell him what I do. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame leap, the dead are raised. And he points at, and I'm just listing a few, he points at these prophecies specifically from Isaiah, mostly chapter 35, but Isaiah 35 and 53, some of 52, like there's some really great chapters in Isaiah that point specifically to messianic prophecy. And what's great about that is that we know for a fact that we have a nearly complete copy of the book of Isaiah from 150 years at least, maybe 200 years before Jesus was born. So we know that these are not prophecies that went back and got changed. These are the things that were predicted before the arrival of Jesus. It's really hard, honestly, to read chapter 53 and not recognize Jesus. A lot of Jews will be presented with chapter 53 and have never read it. They think it comes from the New Testament. It's that clear that it's Jesus, and are shocked to realize that their own prophet wrote these words 700 years before Jesus arrived. Now, Jesus couldn't control his lineage, his birthplace, the people that came before him, and he also couldn't control the timing of his life. You're born when you're born. But the prophecy was that the Messiah would be born in a specific window of time. And that would be before the destruction of the Second Temple. In Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 26, there's the prediction of when he's going to arrive, and it's going to be before this temple that is rebuilt during a time of conflict is destroyed. Jesus couldn't control that. So Jesus' ministry and crucifixion is around 30 AD. So we're not sure if it's 32 AD, if it's 33 AD. Like there's a lot of debate kind of in that window because people didn't keep dates the same way we do now. But we know the date of the temple's destruction was in AD 70. So if Jesus wasn't the Messiah, then no one can fulfill that prophecy. And that was a clear messianic prophecy. So some of the prophecies I mentioned, there are about 300. Some are very clear. This is going to be who the Messiah is, or this is going to be what he's going to do and how he's going to act. And then some are more veiled, and you only see them in kind of hindsight when we look back. But that is a clear, direct prophecy that the Messiah has to fulfill. So no Messiah can come now that is different than Jesus. Jesus can come again. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused, because there's a lot of prophecy that has not been fulfilled yet, because we believe that Jesus is coming a second time. And that second time he's going to come as the warrior, the leader, establishing his kingdom on earth. But that prophecy in Daniel is really powerful. Another prophecy that Jesus couldn't control is his manner of death. So one of the places we want to look for his manner of death as a prophecy is in Psalm 22, because the description of crucifixion is very clear in that passage, even though it had not been invented for centuries after that was written. So David writes this psalm, and it can't be pointing to David because these things didn't happen to David. So while on a metaphorical level, David's talking about being persecuted and mistreated, the exact imagery has to point to Jesus. So Psalm 22:16, they pierced his hands and feet. We see that fulfilled in John 19:18 and 20:25. He was mocked while suffering. We see that fulfilled in Matthew 27. Verses 39 through 43. Lots were cast for his garments in Psalm 22:18. That was fulfilled in John 19:23 and 24. He was silent before his accusers in Isaiah 53:7. We see that fulfilled in Matthew 27, verses 12 through 14. He was buried with the rich. This was prophesied in Isaiah 53, verse 9, and fulfilled in Matthew 27, verses 57 through 60. So again, crucifixion was a Roman method of execution invented centuries after David lived, and yet it was described very perfectly in Psalm 22. Jesus couldn't control Roman law. He couldn't control the census. He couldn't control the Jewish leadership and the way they would respond to him. He couldn't control methods of execution. He couldn't control the way the soldiers behaved at the foot of the cross. But every detail aligns with what happened. Now, let's talk about the chances that somebody else could have fulfilled these prophecies. And this is where Lee Strobel talks in The Case for Christ or The Case for Christmas, because he reiterates some of these ideas in both books. And he read a book that's unfortunately out of print by Peter Stoner, who was a mathematician. And Stoner did the research on the odds that one person could fulfill just eight of the messianic prophecies by chance. So he worked out the chances of Jesus fulfilling 8 of the prophecies was 1 in 100 million billion. Now that's the entire state of Texas being covered 2 feet deep in silver dollars, with one of them being marked, and dropping a blindfolded person in a random place, asking them to pick one silver dollar and them choosing the correct silver dollar. Now, what is the probability of that happening? Essentially 0. Now, that's only fulfilling 8 of the prophecies. What if somebody fulfilled 48 of the prophecies? Now, that chance is 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. Now, that's not 1 in 13 trillion. That's 1 in a trillion times a trillion times a trillion times a trillion 13 times. This number is so astronomically big that we don't have words for it. I mean, we do, but it's inconceivable. And not like The Princess Bride, where he keeps saying that word and it doesn't mean what he thinks it means. It's truly inconceivable how large this number is. The number of atoms in the known universe is 10 to the 80th power. If we took all the atoms in the known universe and marked one of them in red, painted it red somehow, we would need 10 to the 76th power more universes identical to this one, and still have only one marked atom, and ask someone to pick one atom at random out of all of those universes and pick the right one. And that's if Jesus fulfilled 48 of the prophecies. Jesus fulfilled over 300. So at this point, we're no longer talking about probability. We're talking about design. Jesus clearly was the fulfillment of God's perfect plan and design. His identity is established by the total profile, not just one clue. And Jesus fits that profile. He was rejected by his own people in Isaiah 53:3. We saw that fulfilled in John 1:11. He atones for the death of other sins in Isaiah 53, verses 5 and 6 and 11. We see that fulfilled in Romans 5, verses 6 through 8, and 1 Peter 2, verse 24. We see the resurrection predicted in Psalm 16, verse 10, and fulfilled in Acts 2:31. We see a worldwide proclamation in Psalm 22:27, fulfilled in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. Jesus didn't just fulfill prophecy. He transformed history. If you read J. Warner Wallace's book, Person of Interest, you can see the lead up to the Messiah's arrival and why he arrived in that window that he arrived, based on the cultural and spiritual buildup to the world anticipating the arrival of the Messiah, and then the fallout of such a miraculous event occurring. So I really enjoy that book. If you've not read it, I highly recommend it. But it shows why our calendar pivots on this one solitary life. His followers died rather than recant that they had seen him alive. Even his enemies admitted the tomb was empty in Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15. Now, some people will object and say, well, he just tried to fulfill the prophecies. Absolutely. Jesus could have intentionally fulfilled some of the prophecies. He could have ridden in on the donkey's foal intentionally. He could have taught in parables intentionally. But he couldn't choose his birthplace, his lineage. He couldn't choose being intentionally betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He couldn't choose the Roman crucifixion. He couldn't choose being buried in a rich man's tomb. He didn't know that Joseph of Arimathea, Jesus knew, but he couldn't have controlled Joseph of Arimathea offering his brand new tomb. Unless he's God, he couldn't control being resurrected on the third day. As J. Warner Wallace likes to say, you can't fake evidence that your enemies control. So here's the question we're left with. Is it more reasonable to believe that Jesus accidentally fulfilled dozens of ancient prophecies, or that God was telling this story from before it ever happened? I think if we look at the math and we look at the prophecies that we've discussed today, we can see that our faith is not a blind faith. It is reasonable trust grounded in solid evidence. Jesus didn't fulfill prophecies because we need proof. He fulfilled prophecies because he's who he claims to be. So until next time, keep seeking truth, hold fast to faith, and never be afraid to ask the tough questions, because God has answers.